Picture this, right? A brilliant writer, Olivia Lang, is standing in her New York City apartment at night. She's literally surrounded by millions of people, yet she's crying. She can't even bring herself to close her blinds because she feels just entirely paralyzingly exposed to all the strangers in the buildings around her. It's a heavy image, but let's dive into this. Welcome to another Explainer where we take a real deep dive into the psychological literature. Today we're unpacking the profound and honestly sometimes really painful paradox of urban isolation.
So welcome to all the social psychology students joining us today. We're exploring the lonely city, a psychological journey through urban isolation.
You know, Olivia Lang actually moved to Manhattan after a devastating heartbreak, only to find herself totally adrift. Which really brings us to the core mystery of our topic today. How is it possible to feel completely desolate while living cheek by jowl with millions of people? As Lang so sharply notes on her own personal journey, just having mere physical proximity, well, it's not enough to cure a sense of internal isolation. We're going to transition now from our personal pain into our clinical analysis to understand exactly why living in a densely populated metropolis doesn't automatically cure loneliness, and how, paradoxically, it can actually push us further into our own lonely corners.
All right, Section 1, the anatomy of loneliness. Let's look at the internal mechanisms at play here.
As future clinicians, there's a really vital distinction you've got to make right off the bat. Social isolation is an objective, measurable lack of company, or social privation. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, is the subjective, deeply painful feeling of lacking desired intimacy. Lang points to the ancient philosopher Epictetus, who famously noted that just because a person is alone, it absolutely doesn't mean they are solitary. And conversely, being in a crowd doesn't magically mean you're connected. Loneliness is really that painful, subjective gap between the intimacy you desperately want and the intimacy you actually have.
Now, this gap in intimacy builds into something far more dangerous. When people enter into an experience of loneliness, they trigger what psychologists call hypervigilance for social threat. This is basically a subconscious state where an individual begins to expect, remember, and actually magnify instances of rejection. It creates this absolutely tragic, vicious cycle. Loneliness acts almost like a prophylactic, like a barrier of fur or mold that just inhibits contact. It causes the brain to warp perception, so even super minor social interactions are suddenly registered as overwhelming threats. And because this bias is subconscious, it's incredibly difficult for the lonely person to even recognize it, let alone correct it.
Just listen to Lang regarding her own time in New York. She writes, "The intensity of my reaction testified to hypervigilance. The slightest glitch in communication was registering as a potentially overwhelming threat." She describes simply sitting in a cafe, right? And just a tiny, everyday misstep in conversation with a waiter caused a full-blown blast of panic. Her body's internal measuring system had identified danger where there literally was none, basically forcing her to flee deeper into the interior of herself, terrified of being rejected.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that this isn't just in your head. It creates a devastating physiological cascade. Subjective loneliness creates a biological reality. Step 1. The chronic loneliness stressor puts the body on high red alert. Step 2. This triggers constant tides of adrenaline and cortisol, our fight or flight hormones. Because this stress is chronic and you just can't outrun it, it leads to Step 3, a weakened immune system, disrupted sleep, and accelerated aging. Which inevitably brings us to Step 4. As studies show, loneliness actually predicts increased morbidity and mortality. I mean, think about that. Subjective emotional loneliness is a physical trauma that can literally be fatal.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, Architecture of Isolation. We'll now look at the external triggers.
Imagine walking at night and looking up at a tall apartment building. As Lang notes, the city reveals itself as a set of glowing cells. You see strangers inside just going about the business of their private hours. You can see them, but you absolutely cannot reach them. For Lang, and honestly for a lot of urban dwellers, looking into these lit windows at night induces a really unique tremor of loneliness. It highlights this uneasy combination of separation and exposure. You're physically just inches away, yet you're entirely locked out.
And this brings us to a really fascinating architectural tension. Windows like walls, walls like windows. In the city, you're separated by these glass barriers, yet almost unbearably exposed to a stranger's gaze. Lang actually analyzes the visual translation of this in Edward Hopper's famous paintings. You know the ones. Hopper routinely reproduced urban spaces that placed people physically close together, but separated them by movement, structural things, or glass. It creates this kind of anxious, voyeuristic entrapment. You feel completely walled off from community, but you're hyper-aware that someone, somewhere, could be watching you.
Which brings us to Section 3, Technology and the Buffer. Let's talk about mediating connection. So here is a really critical question for our pixelated age. Does technology cure loneliness, or does it just buffer us from the risk of connection? To understand this, Lang actually looks at the iconic artist Andy Warhol. Despite being famously surrounded by entourages all the time, Warhol struggled with profound isolation and was terrified of physical contact. To cope, he used tape recorders and televisions as surrogates for love. He literally used his cameras to broker and buffer his interactions. He deeply wanted connection for sure, but he needed it mediated by a machine to actually feel safe.
And wow, that historical example just perfectly maps onto what we face today with the smartphone paradox. Our modern devices provide a sort of nominal connection, all while keeping us sealed in a risk-free private bubble. As social psychology students, you guys know that true intimacy requires vulnerability, right? The risk of collapse, spread, and merging with another person. But smartphones are deeply appealing precisely because they offer a simulation of closeness, without the terrifying vulnerability of being rejected, misunderstood, or just overwhelmed in person. It's a managed, low-risk form of contact that keeps us safe, but ultimately kind of leaves us still lonely.
Finally, Section 4, Reclaiming Human Connection, Kindness and Solidarity.
But if technology isn't the cure, what actually is? Well, we have to challenge a strictly clinical, reductionist view of loneliness. Lang writes something really powerful. There is a gentrification that is happening to the emotions too. We are fed the notion that all difficult feelings are simply a consequence of unsettled chemistry. Drawing on the histories of marginalized groups in New York, she argues that as cities gentrify, they push out diversity and basically sanitize human interaction. And by doing so, society pathologizes completely valid emotional responses, like loneliness or rage. We treat them as individual medical failures to be fixed, rather than natural human responses to structural injustice and exclusion.
So, the massive takeaway here is that the cure for loneliness isn't just meeting someone or popping a pill, it's kindness and solidarity. Lang's journey concludes by radically reframing loneliness. It is not some individual failing or a shameful flaw that you need to hide away. No, it is a shared, collective human experience. We inhabit a world full of scars and physical limitations, and what truly matters in navigating this lonely city is remaining open, acknowledging our mutual vulnerability, and fostering genuine empathy for one another.
And so, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. As future clinicians, how will you view the gentrification of emotions in your own clinical and personal lives? When a patient comes to you feeling profoundly isolated, will you look beyond just the brain chemistry of that isolation and recognize the vital importance of human solidarity and the systemic forces at play? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive leaves you with a profound new lens on the anatomy of human connection. I'll see you next time.